The glass shattered against the wall a moment after Eleanor Ashworth said the word no. Her father's hand trembled around the empty space where the glass had been. His face turned a deep shade of red, and the dining room fell into a silence so heavy that even the candles seemed to stop flickering. Around the long table sat the guests he had invited to witness her agreement, men and women dressed in their finest clothes, all of them now staring at the girl who had just refused to marry Lord Cassius Vane in front of everyone. Eleanor did not look away from her father. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her voice had not shaken when she spoke. She would not marry a man twice her age simply because her father owed him money he could not repay. She would not become a piece of property traded across a dinner table to erase a debt. Edgar Ashworth stood up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, aware of the guests watching him. Instead, he turned to Lord Vane, who sat at the head of the table with a thin, unreadable smile on his lips, and offered an apology dressed in false laughter, calling his daughter tired and confused. Eleanor said nothing to correct him. She simply rose from her seat, excused herself with quiet politeness, and walked out of the dining room before her legs could give way beneath her. She did not cry until she reached her bedroom. Even then, she pressed her hand over her mouth so the sound would not carry down the hallway. She had known there would be a price for refusing him. She had not expected it to arrive so quickly. By morning, her allowance had been stopped. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman who rarely dared to disagree with her husband, delivered the news without meeting Eleanor's eyes. She was to move out of her bedroom on the second floor and take a small room near the kitchens, the kind given to servants who had nowhere else to sleep. Her books were left behind. Her fine dresses were locked away. She was told, plainly, that she would live like the people she now had to work beside, until she came to her senses. Eleanor carried her own belongings down the narrow staircase herself, refusing to let the housemaids do it for her. She passed her younger brother on the stairs, a boy of 14 who looked at her with something between pity and confusion. Too young to understand why his sister was being punished for saying a single word, she managed a small smile for him, though her chest ached with the effort of it. The room near the kitchens was small and cold, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the stable yard. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed for a long time that first night, staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, wondering how a family could turn so completely against one of their own. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the household, and then beyond it. Servants whispered when they thought she could not hear. Some of them looked at her with sympathy, understanding all too well what it meant to have no power over one's own life. Others looked at her with suspicion, as though her defiance might somehow threaten the fragile order they depended on to keep their positions. Her father did not speak to her again for nearly a week. When he finally did, it was not out of concern but out of desperation. Lord Vane's patience, he said, would not last forever, and neither would the family's finances. He asked her, almost pleading now, to reconsider, to think of her mother, her brother, the roof over their heads. Eleanor listened to him without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him a single question in return. Had he ever, even once, asked her what she wanted for her own life? He had no answer for that. It was decided, without her input, that she would be sent away from the main house to work as a companion in the household of a distant family friend, a widow named Mrs. Pemberton, who lived on a large country estate several miles outside town. The arrangement was framed as an opportunity, a chance for Eleanor to earn her keep and reflect on her behavior in a more disciplined setting. In truth, everyone understood it for what it was. She was being sent away so her family would not have to look at her, and so Lord Vane would not have to be reminded, day after day, of the humiliation of being refused. Eleanor left before dawn, in a plain carriage with a single trunk of belongings she had been permitted to keep. Her mother pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into her hands at the door, along with a whispered apology that came far too late to mean much. Her brother ran out to the carriage in his nightclothes and hugged her tightly, before anyone could stop him. Her father did not come to say goodbye at all. The journey to Mrs. Pemberton's estate took most of the morning, along roads lined with tall hedges and quiet fields still wet with dew. Eleanor watched the countryside pass by the window, feeling strangely calm despite everything that had happened. For the first time in weeks, she was leaving behind the house that had made her feel like a stranger in her own family, and though she did not know what waited for her ahead, it could hardly be worse than what she had already survived. Mrs. Pemberton's estate was grander than Eleanor had expected, with tall stone walls covered in ivy and gardens that stretched far beyond what a single family could ever need. The widow herself turned out to be a sharp, observant woman who wasted no time on false kindness but was not unkind either. She looked Eleanor over carefully when she arrived, asked her a handful of pointed questions about her education and her temperament, and declared, with something close to approval, that she would do well enough. Eleanor's duties were simple at first. She was to read to Mrs. Pemberton in the afternoons, help manage her correspondence, and accompany her on short walks through the gardens when her health allowed it. It was far gentler work than she had feared, and within a few days she began to settle into a quiet, steady rhythm, one that asked nothing more of her than patience and attention. It was on her fourth evening at the estate that she first saw him. She had gone out to the edge of the garden just after sunset, drawn by the cool air and the need for a moment alone with her thoughts. Beyond the low stone wall that separated Mrs. Pemberton's property from the neighboring estate, a tall figure stood near the tree line, dressed in dark traveling clothes that suggested he had only just arrived. He was not looking toward her at first, his attention fixed on the darkening sky, but something in the stillness of his posture made her pause where she stood. Then he turned his head, as though he had felt her watching him, and their eyes met across the short distance between the two properties. Eleanor did not know who he was, only that his gaze held hers for a moment longer than was proper, and that something about the encounter left her oddly breathless. She looked away first, retreating a step toward the safety of the garden path, though she could still feel the weight of his attention even after she had turned her back. Later that night, one of the younger housemaids, a cheerful girl named Alice who seemed to know everything happening in the neighborhood, mentioned in passing that the estate next door had a new resident, a nobleman who had recently returned to the country after many years abroad. He kept largely to himself, Alice said, and the local families were already whispering about his fortune, his silence, and the fact that he had not yet attended a single social gathering since his arrival. Eleanor listened to the gossip with only mild interest, telling herself that whoever the stranger was, his life had nothing to do with hers. She had come to this estate to work, to earn a small measure of independence, and to stay as far as possible from the kind of arrangements that had already cost her so much. Yet as she lay in her narrow bed that night, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, she found herself thinking of the stranger's steady gaze more than once. There had been something in it, she thought, that was neither pity nor curiosity, but something closer to recognition, as though he too understood what it meant to stand apart from everyone around him. She told herself it meant nothing. She had learned, after everything her family had done, not to trust things that felt too much like hope. But when she finally drifted into sleep, it was his face she saw, not Lord Vane's, and not her father's, and for reasons she could not yet explain. That single fact frightened her more than anything else that had happened since the night she said no. The next morning brought a fine mist over the gardens, and Eleanor rose earlier than she needed to, telling herself it was only to enjoy the quiet before her duties began. She walked the same path she had taken the evening before, past the low stone wall, though she was careful not to let her steps slow as she passed it. The tree line on the other side stood empty, and she felt a small, foolish twist of disappointment before she caught herself and pushed the feeling away. Mrs. Pemberton noticed her distraction almost at once. The older woman had a way of watching people that made it difficult to hide anything from her, and over breakfast she asked, without much preamble, whether Eleanor had slept well. Eleanor assured her that she had, though the widow's raised eyebrow suggested she was not entirely convinced. Rather than press the matter, Mrs. Pemberton spoke instead of the neighboring estate, mentioning that its owner had inherited the property only recently, after the death of a distant relative, and that he had spent most of his life far from this part of the country, building a fortune in trade that had made him the subject of considerable curiosity among the local families. Eleanor listened politely, careful not to show too much interest, though she found herself remembering every detail all the same. She learned that the new owner rarely left his estate, that he had turned down 2 invitations to dinner already, and that no one seemed to know quite what to make of a nobleman who preferred solitude to society. Mrs. Pemberton seemed to find the whole situation faintly amusing, remarking that a man with that much money and that little interest in showing it off was either very wise or very strange, and she had not yet decided which. The days that followed settled into a gentle routine. Eleanor read to Mrs. Pemberton each afternoon, her voice steady even when the stories grew tiresome, and in the evenings, she walked the garden paths alone, watching the light fade over the hills. She told herself each time that she was not looking for the stranger from the tree line, and each time she caught her eyes drifting toward the low stone wall regardless. It was nearly a week before she saw him again, and this time it was not by chance. She had gone further than usual along the garden's edge, following a narrow gap in the hedge that led toward a small orchard she had not yet explored. She was so absorbed in the quiet beauty of the place, the early blossoms just beginning to open on the branches, that she did not notice she had crossed onto the neighboring property until a voice spoke behind her, calm and unhurried, asking if she always wandered into places she had not been invited. She turned quickly, her cheeks warming with embarrassment, and found herself face to face with the very man she had been trying not to think about. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, with dark eyes that studied her without any trace of judgment, only a quiet curiosity that matched her own. She began to apologize, to explain that she had lost track of the boundary between the two properties, but he raised a hand gently, telling her there was no need, that the orchard had gone unused for years, and it seemed a shame for something so lovely to remain unseen. They spoke only briefly that first meeting, exchanging little more than their names, though even that small exchange left Eleanor unsettled in a way she could not fully explain. His name, she learned, was Alaric Whitmore, and though he did not say the word Duke aloud, something in the way the household staff had spoken of him made her suspect the title was not far behind his name. He asked nothing of her past, nothing of her family, and for that alone she found herself grateful, since it meant she did not have to explain the small room near the kitchens she had left behind, or the reason a young woman of her upbringing was now working as a companion to an elderly widow. When she finally excused herself to return to the house, she could still feel his eyes following her long after she had stepped back through the gap in the hedge. She walked the rest of the way in silence, her heart beating faster than the short distance should have warranted, and it was only once she was safely inside her small room that she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to deny since the night she first saw him standing at the edge of the trees. Whoever Alaric Whitmore truly was, he had already become something she had not expected to find so soon after everything she had lost. A small, quiet reason to look forward to the coming days. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon, carried by a boy from the village who refused to say who had sent him. Eleanor recognized her father's handwriting the moment she broke the seal, and her stomach tightened before she had even read the first line. He wrote of Lord Vane's growing impatience, of debts that had multiplied rather than shrunk, and of a fresh offer that would settle everything, if only she would return home and reconsider her answer. There was no mention of love in the letter, no mention of her happiness, only numbers and consequences laid out as though she were a column in his account book rather than his daughter. She folded the letter carefully and placed it at the bottom of her trunk, beneath the few belongings she had brought with her, as though burying it there might also bury the fear it had stirred in her chest. She did not tell Mrs. Pemberton what the letter contained, though the older woman noticed her quiet mood at dinner and did not press for an explanation, choosing instead to fill the silence with stories from her own younger years, tales of choices she had made and the prices she had paid for them. Eleanor found herself walking to the orchard more often after that, drawn by the memory of the conversation she had shared there and by a need to escape the weight of her father's words. She told herself each time that she was simply enjoying the quiet, that the blossoms were pleasant to look at, that the fresh air cleared her mind. She did not admit, even to herself, how often her feet carried her there at the exact hour she had first met Alaric Whitmore, or how disappointed she felt on the days he did not appear. When he did appear, their conversations grew longer, more comfortable, though neither of them spoke of anything too personal at first. He asked about the books she had read to Mrs. Pemberton, and she found herself surprised by how easily he could discuss them, offering opinions that were sharp and thoughtful, rather than the polite nothings she had grown used to hearing from men of his standing. She learned that he had spent nearly a decade abroad, building trade connections across distant ports, and that he had only returned to claim his title after the death of an uncle he had barely known. He spoke of his years away with a kind of restrained pride, though there was something guarded beneath his words, a sense that he was choosing carefully what to share and what to leave unsaid. Eleanor found herself doing the same. She spoke of her love for reading, of a childhood spent mostly indoors while her brother ran wild through the fields, of small, safe memories that revealed little about the wound still fresh beneath the surface. It was Alaric who first noticed the shadow that crossed her face whenever the conversation drifted too close to her family, and though he did not press her to explain it, he made it clear, in his own quiet way, that he had noticed. It happened on an overcast afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after their first meeting, that he finally asked her directly why a young woman of her clear intelligence and evident upbringing was spending her days as a companion to an elderly widow rather than enjoying the usual comforts of her own household. Eleanor's first instinct was to deflect the question, to offer some vague answer about wanting independence, but something about the steadiness of his gaze made the practiced excuse die on her lips. She told him the truth instead, or most of it. She spoke of the marriage her father had tried to arrange, of the debts that had made her little more than a bargaining piece, of the night she had refused in front of a room full of guests, and the punishment that had followed. She kept her voice steady as she spoke, refusing to let it shake, though she watched his expression carefully for any sign of the judgment she had grown to expect from others who heard her story. There was no judgment in his face. Instead, something in his posture shifted, a stillness that felt less like surprise and more like recognition, as though her story had touched a nerve he had not expected to be touched. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was lower than before, almost reluctant, as he admitted that he understood more of her situation than she might expect. He told her, carefully and without much detail, that his own path to his title had not been entirely his choice either. His family had expected him to marry young, to secure alliances through arrangements he had wanted no part of, and it was that very expectation that had driven him abroad in the first place, choosing distance and hard work over a life mapped out entirely by other people's ambitions. He had built his fortune, he said, not because he needed the money, but because he needed to prove, if only to himself, that he could shape his own life rather than simply inherit one. Eleanor listened to him with a growing sense of understanding, surprised to find so much of her own frustration mirrored in his words. For the first time since the night of her refusal, she felt as though someone truly understood the weight of being treated as an obligation rather than a person, and the realization loosened something tight in her chest that she had not even known was there. Their conversation shifted after that, growing easier, more open, though both of them remained careful not to name what was happening between them. Eleanor told herself it was simply friendship, a rare comfort in a life that had offered her very little comfort of late. She reminded herself, whenever her thoughts wandered too far, that a man of his wealth and standing had no real reason to pursue anything more than casual conversation with a woman whose own family had cast her aside. Yet the visits to the orchard continued, sometimes twice in a single week, and Alaric began to find small reasons to extend their time together, walking her partway back toward Mrs. Pemberton's gardens, or bringing a book he thought she might enjoy, always careful to frame the gesture as nothing more than simple kindness. Eleanor accepted each gesture with quiet gratitude, telling herself she was not reading too much into any of it, even as some part of her began, cautiously, to hope. News of the growing friendship did not stay contained to the two of them for long. Alice, the cheerful housemaid who seemed to know everything, mentioned one evening that the stable hands had begun to notice how often the young Duke rode toward the boundary between the two estates, and how his visits always seemed to coincide with the hours Eleanor took her walks. Eleanor felt her face flush at the observation, quickly insisting there was nothing to the matter, though Alice's knowing smile suggested she was not entirely convinced. Mrs. Pemberton, too, seemed to notice the change in her young companion, the lighter step, the small smile that appeared unbidden at odd moments throughout the day. She said nothing directly, though one evening, as Eleanor read to her by the fire, the widow remarked, almost offhandedly, that it did a person good to be seen by someone who did not want anything from them in return. Eleanor did not answer, but she understood the words were not idle, and she carried them with her long after the reading had ended. It was nearly 3 weeks into their quiet friendship that a second letter arrived from her father, this one sharper in tone than the first. Lord Vane, it seemed, had grown tired of waiting, and had begun making inquiries of his own, asking pointed questions about her whereabouts and her conduct since leaving the family home. Her father's letter carried a warning beneath its careful politeness, a reminder that her absence could not continue indefinitely, and that further delay would only make matters worse for everyone involved, herself most of all. Eleanor read the letter twice before folding it away, her earlier lightness replaced by a familiar tightness in her chest. She said nothing of it to Alaric when they met again in the orchard the following afternoon, though he noticed the change in her almost immediately, the careful distance in her posture, the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes. When he asked, gently, what troubled her, she found herself, for the first time, unwilling to share the full truth, afraid that speaking Lord Vane's name aloud in this quiet place might somehow summon the danger closer. Instead, she deflected, offering only that matters at home remained unresolved, and Alaric, sensing her reluctance, did not push further, though the concern in his eyes lingered long after their conversation had moved on to safer subjects. As the sun began to set behind the orchard trees that evening, casting long shadows across the grass between them, Eleanor found herself wondering, not for the first time, how much longer she could keep the two halves of her life apart, the quiet peace she had found beside this man, and the storm that continued to gather, unseen but unmistakable, back at the house she had once called home. That night, sleep did not come easily. Eleanor lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, turning her father's letter over and over in her mind, until the words no longer seemed to make sense. She thought of Lord Vane's thin smile at the dinner table, The way he had looked at her not as a person but as something to be acquired, and she thought too of Alaric's steady gaze in the orchard, so different from anything she had known before. The contrast between the two men frightened her almost as much as it comforted her, because it made her realize how much she had begun to want something she had no right to expect. In the morning, Mrs. Pemberton asked her to accompany her into the village to collect a parcel of fabric that had arrived from the city, and Eleanor welcomed the distraction. The village was small but lively, its narrow street lined with shops and stalls, and for a few hours, she allowed herself to forget the weight of the letter waiting in her trunk. She helped Mrs. Pemberton choose ribbons for a new gown, admired a display of pressed flowers in a shop window, and laughed, for the first time in days, at a story the shopkeeper told about his mischievous cat. It was on the walk back to the carriage that she saw a familiar figure across the street, and her heart gave an unexpected leap before she realized it was not Alaric at all, but a man who merely shared his height and the darkness of his coat. The disappointment that followed surprised her with its intensity, and she scolded herself quietly for allowing her thoughts to drift so easily toward a man she had known for barely a month. Mrs. Pemberton noticed the exchange, of course. Very little escaped her sharp eyes, and once they were settled in the carriage for the ride home, she spoke without any of her usual roundabout manner. She told Eleanor plainly that she had lived long enough to recognize the particular quiet that came over a young woman who had begun to care for someone, and that she would not pretend not to notice it simply because Eleanor had not spoken of it herself. Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again, unable to find words that would sound honest. Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened, and she reached over to pat Eleanor's hand in a rare gesture of open affection. She said that whatever troubles Eleanor carried from her family, she deserved to have something good in her life that was entirely her own, chosen freely rather than forced upon her. She did not ask for details, and Eleanor did not offer them, but the exchange left her feeling less alone than she had in weeks, as though even this brief acknowledgement had lifted some small portion of the weight she carried. The following days brought no further word from her father, and Eleanor allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that the silence meant some reprieve, however temporary. She returned to the orchard each afternoon she could manage, and her conversations with Alaric grew steadily more comfortable, touching now on subjects neither of them had dared raise before. He told her, one afternoon, about the ship that had carried him away from England for the first time, how frightened and free he had felt standing at the rail as the coastline disappeared behind him, and how strange it had been to return, years later, to a title and a house that felt more like a stranger's inheritance than his own. Eleanor found herself sharing more too, small memories she had not spoken of in years, the sound of her brother's laughter echoing through the halls of her childhood home, the smell of her mother's garden in early summer before everything between them had grown so complicated. She spoke of her mother with a gentleness that surprised even her, aware that whatever failures her mother had shown in standing up to her father, there had also been small kindnesses, offered quietly and without much courage, that Eleanor had never quite forgotten. Alaric listened to all of it with the same careful attention he gave to everything she said, and it was during one of these quiet exchanges, as the afternoon light slanted gold through the orchard trees, that Eleanor first allowed herself to truly consider what she felt for him. It was not simply gratitude for his kindness, nor comfort in his understanding, but something deeper and more unsettling, a warmth that had settled into her chest and refused to leave no matter how firmly she tried to reason it away. She did not speak of it aloud, and neither, it seemed, did he, though there were moments, brief and fleeting, when their eyes would meet and hold a beat longer than the conversation required, when his hand would come close to hers as he passed her a book or steadied her step over an uneven patch of ground, and something unspoken would pass between them, too new and too fragile for either of them to name. Eleanor left the orchard each evening with her heart lighter than it had been in months, even as the letter in her trunk remained a constant, quiet reminder that this fragile peace could not last forever, that somewhere beyond the boundary of these two quiet estates, her father and Lord Vane were still waiting, and their patience, unlike her own newfound happiness, was rapidly running out. The invitation arrived at Mrs. Pemberton's estate on a bright morning, delivered by a footman in fine livery who bowed low before presenting it. It was for a garden gathering hosted by the Cranmore family, one of the most prominent in the county, and Mrs. Pemberton, despite her usual preference for quiet evenings at home, declared that they would attend. She explained, with a knowing look in Eleanor's direction, that it would do the girl good to be seen in society again, even if only as a companion rather than a guest of honor. Eleanor's stomach twisted at the news. She had spent weeks avoiding exactly this kind of gathering, aware that word of her refusal and her family's punishment had likely spread through the same circles that would fill the Cranmore Gardens. Yet she could not refuse Mrs. Pemberton outright, not after everything the widow had done for her, and so she found herself, 3 days later, dressed in a borrowed gown of pale blue, standing at the edge of a lawn crowded with people who all seemed to know exactly who she was, and exactly what had happened to her. The whispers began almost immediately. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed, voices lowered but not nearly low enough, speculating about her refusal, her banishment to a companion's position, and whether the rumors of her instability held any truth. She kept her chin high and her expression composed, though each remark landed like a small blow, chipping away at the calm she had worked so hard to build over the past weeks. It was Lord Cassius Vane himself who delivered the deepest wound. He arrived later than most of the guests, dressed with his usual careless elegance, and made his way directly toward the small group gathered near Eleanor and Mrs. Pemberton, his thin smile already in place. He greeted the widow with practiced courtesy before turning his attention to Eleanor, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear every word. He spoke of her refusal as though it had been a joke gone too far, expressing false sympathy for her family's difficulties, and suggesting, with a tone that dripped with mock concern, that perhaps the strain of managing a household's expectations had proven too much for a girl of her delicate temperament. He mentioned, casually, that he had heard she had been sent away to work, as though the position she now held was something shameful rather than simply necessary, and he wondered aloud, to the small crowd now gathering around them, whether she might reconsider her hasty decision now that she had experienced firsthand what life looked like, without the comforts she had once taken for granted. Eleanor felt her face burn with humiliation as laughter rippled through the small crowd, some of it polite and uncertain, some of it openly cruel. She opened her mouth to respond, though no words came, her carefully built composure crumbling under the weight of so many eyes fixed on her at once. Mrs. Pemberton beside her stiffened with visible anger, but even the widow's sharp tongue seemed momentarily silenced by the boldness of Lord Vane's public performance. It was then that a new voice cut through the gathering, calm and unhurried, carrying an authority that made the crowd fall silent almost instantly. Alaric Whitmore had arrived without anyone noticing, standing at the edge of the group with an expression that gave away nothing of what he felt, though his eyes, when they settled on Eleanor, held a warmth that steadied her more than she expected. He stepped forward, addressing Lord Vane directly, his tone polite but edged with something sharp enough to make the other man's smile falter for the first time since he had arrived. He remarked, with the same casual elegance Lord Vane had used moments before, that it seemed a strange kind of courage for a man to mock a woman's difficult circumstances in public, particularly when those circumstances had been forced upon her rather than chosen. He noted, further, that a man secure in his own worth rarely needed to belittle others to feel superior, and he wondered, quite pointedly, whether Lord Vane's continued interest in a woman who had so clearly refused him spoke more of wounded pride than genuine affection. The crowd's laughter died away entirely, replaced by a tense, uncertain silence. Lord Vane's face reddened, though he attempted to recover his composure, offering a stiff remark about the impropriety of strangers interfering in matters that did not concern them. Alaric's response was immediate and cutting, delivered without raising his voice, as he informed the gathered guests that he counted Mrs. Pemberton and her companion among his acquaintances, and that he would not stand by quietly while either of them was subjected to such treatment in his presence. The mention of his title, spoken deliberately for the first time since he had arrived, rippled through the crowd with visible effect. Whispers of recognition spread quickly, guests exchanging startled glances as they realized precisely who had just intervened on Eleanor's behalf. Lord Vane, clearly unsettled by the shift in the crowd's attention, offered a stiff bow and excused himself, retreating toward the far end of the garden with as much dignity as he could manage, though the damage to his standing had already been done. Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment after he had gone, aware of the many eyes still lingering on her, though their expressions had shifted now, curiosity replacing cruelty, admiration mixing with confusion as the guests tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Pemberton recovered first, steering the conversation back toward safer subjects with practiced skill, and slowly the gathering began to move on, though the whispers continued, now carrying an entirely different tone. It was Alaric who finally approached her directly, once the immediate attention had begun to fade, his expression softening as he asked quietly whether she was well. Eleanor found she could not quite speak at first, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from humiliation to something that felt dangerously close to hope. She managed eventually to thank him, though her voice wavered, and he waved off her gratitude with a small, almost embarrassed shake of his head, insisting that anyone with a shred of decency would have done the same. She did not entirely believe him, though she did not say so, aware that few of the people gathered on that lawn had shown any inclination toward decency at all until his intervention had forced their hand. They spoke only briefly before propriety demanded they part ways, though the warmth in his eyes as he excused himself lingered with her long after he had disappeared back into the crowd. The rest of the gathering passed in a blur, Eleanor moving through the remaining hours in a state of careful composure, aware that every word and gesture would be scrutinized and repeated long after she had gone. When she and Mrs. Pemberton finally departed, the older woman remarked, with unusual gentleness, that whatever else the afternoon had cost her, it had also revealed something valuable, namely the true character of the man who had chosen to stand beside her when it would have been far easier to remain silent. News of the confrontation spread through the county faster than either of them could have anticipated. By the following morning, Mrs. Pemberton's household had already received 2 callers eager to discuss the events of the garden party, and Alice reported, with barely contained excitement, that the servants at the Cranmore estate could speak of nothing else. Lord Vane's reputation, it seemed, had suffered considerably, while Eleanor found herself the unexpected subject of a curiosity that felt entirely different from the cruel gossip of the previous weeks. Her father's reaction, when it came, arrived not as a letter but as an unannounced visit, his carriage rolling up the drive of Mrs. Pemberton's estate only 2 days after the party. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as he stepped down, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear, and she braced herself for whatever confrontation was about to follow. He did not raise his voice when they finally spoke, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the effort it cost him to remain calm. He informed her, without preamble, that word of the Duke of Ashcombe's intervention on her behalf had reached him, and that he wished to understand precisely what had transpired between them. Eleanor explained the events plainly, refusing to embellish or apologize for a friendship she had done nothing wrong in forming, and watched as calculation slowly replaced anger in her father's expression. He asked, carefully, whether the Duke's interest in her extended beyond simple courtesy, and Eleanor felt a fresh wave of anger rise in her chest at the question, recognizing immediately the direction his thoughts had taken. She told him, firmly, that whatever existed between herself and Alaric Whitmore was not a matter to be weighed and measured like Lord Vane's debts, and that she would not allow her father to treat this friendship as merely another opportunity for advantage. Her father did not argue the point directly, though his silence spoke clearly enough of the schemes already forming behind his eyes. He left shortly after, offering no apology for his earlier treatment of her, no acknowledgement of the months of punishment he had inflicted, only a final, pointed remark that a duke's favor, once secured, could solve problems far greater than the ones Lord Vane's marriage proposal had ever promised to fix. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the drive with a growing sense of unease. She understood, with painful clarity, that her father's sudden interest in Alaric had nothing to do with her happiness, and everything to do with the opportunities his wealth and title represented. She thought of Alaric's own words in the orchard, of his years spent building a life free from other people's expectations, and she felt a fresh stab of fear at the thought of her family attempting to draw him into the same web of obligation that had already cost her so much. She resolved, that evening, to speak with him directly, to warn him of her father's intentions before they had the chance to take root, though she could not yet know how deeply the coming days would test not only her family's schemes but the fragile, unspoken bond that had grown between them in the quiet safety of the orchard. She found him the following afternoon exactly where she expected, standing beneath the blossoming trees with a book he did not appear to be reading, his attention drifting instead toward the gap in the hedge through which she always arrived. He greeted her with the small, private smile that had become familiar to her over the past weeks, though it faded quickly once he saw the worry written plainly across her face. She told him everything, the visit from her father, the pointed questions about his intentions, the cold calculations she had seen replace his anger the moment he understood a duke had taken an interest in his daughter's welfare. She watched Alaric's expression carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for discomfort, perhaps even withdrawal, aware that few men of his standing would welcome being treated as a solution to another family's financial troubles. To her surprise, he did not look troubled so much as thoughtful, listening to her account with the same careful attention he gave to everything she said. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning the book over once in his hands before setting it aside entirely. He told her, gently, that he had suspected something of this nature might follow the events at the Cranmore garden, that a man's fortune rarely went unnoticed for long by those seeking to use it, and that he had encountered similar schemes often enough during his years abroad to recognize the pattern immediately. What worried him more, he admitted, was not her father's ambition but the possibility that Eleanor might feel responsible for it, that she might believe herself somehow at fault for circumstances entirely outside her control. He said this with such quiet certainty that Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen, a tension she had not realized she was carrying until it began to ease. She admitted, haltingly, that she did feel some measure of guilt, that she worried her father's schemes might taint whatever existed between them, turning something she had come to value so deeply into just another transaction, another arrangement built on obligation rather than genuine feeling. Alaric listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he stepped closer, closing the small distance that had always remained carefully between them during their conversations. He told her, with a directness that left no room for doubt, that nothing her father schemed or arranged could change what he felt when he was in her company, that his interest in her had never been a matter of convenience or obligation, but something that had grown, slowly and entirely on its own, from the very first evening he had seen her standing at the edge of Mrs. Pemberton's garden. He admitted that he had told himself, more than once, to keep his distance, aware of how easily his position could complicate her already difficult circumstances, but that he had found himself unable to stay away regardless. Eleanor felt her breath catch at his words, unable to fully believe what she was hearing after so many weeks of careful, unspoken restraint between them. She asked, quietly, what he intended to do now that her father's intentions had become so plain, and Alaric's expression grew serious as he considered the question. He told her that he had no intention of allowing her father or Lord Vane to dictate the terms of whatever existed between them, that he would continue seeing her openly and without shame, regardless of the schemes forming around them, though he acknowledged that doing so would likely draw even more attention and speculation than the garden party already had. He asked her, with unusual gentleness, whether she was prepared for what might follow, whether she wanted to continue forward despite the risk to her reputation and the certainty of her father's continued interference. Eleanor did not answer immediately, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought of the humiliation she had already endured, the isolation of the small room near the kitchens, the cold calculation in her father's eyes during his visit, and she thought too of the quiet peace she had found in this orchard, the warmth of a friendship that had grown into something far deeper than she had ever expected to find again after the night she had said no to Lord Vane. She told him, finally, that she was tired of allowing other people to decide the shape of her life, that she had already paid a heavy price for choosing her own path once, and that she would not abandon it now simply because the path had grown more complicated. Whatever came next, she said, she wanted to face it honestly, without pretending her feelings were anything less than what they truly were. Alaric's expression softened into something Eleanor had not seen from him before, a rare openness that made her chest ache with a feeling she was only beginning to understand. He reached for her hand then, the first time he had done so since they had met, and though the gesture was simple, it carried a weight that neither of them needed to put into words. They stood together beneath the blossoming trees for a long moment, saying nothing further, though the silence between them felt fuller than any conversation they had shared before. It was Mrs. Pemberton, in her own quiet way, who confirmed the seriousness of the situation a few days later, mentioning over breakfast that she had received 2 separate letters from acquaintances in the county, both eager to discuss the growing rumors surrounding Eleanor and the reclusive young Duke next door. She warned Eleanor gently that whatever peace they had enjoyed in the orchard would soon be tested by the full weight of public attention, and that her father, having already glimpsed the advantage such a match might offer, would not remain idle for long. Eleanor took the warning seriously, though she found she could not regret the path she had chosen, even knowing the difficulties that likely lay ahead. She had spent months being punished for a single word of refusal, treated as though her own wishes counted for nothing against her family's convenience. Whatever storms were still gathering beyond the quiet boundary of the orchard, she resolved to face them this time not as a girl with no power over her own life, but as a woman who had finally found something worth standing firm for, and someone willing to stand firm beside her. Edgar Ashworth did not visit again after his brief, calculating conversation with his daughter, though his absence brought Eleanor no comfort. She understood, from years of watching him manage his failing business, that silence from her father rarely meant surrender. It meant, instead, that he was working quietly on some new arrangement, and she suspected, with growing dread, that this time the arrangement would involve Lord Vane as well. She was right to worry. It was Alice, arriving breathless one afternoon from an errand in the village, who first brought word of what was being planned. A stable boy from the Cranmore estate, sweet on one of the kitchen maids, had let slip that Lord Vane had been overheard discussing a scheme with 2 men Alice did not recognize, something involving a private evening gathering to which Eleanor would be invited under false pretenses, and a plan to ensure she was discovered alone with Lord Vane in circumstances that would leave her reputation with no possible defense. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Alice repeated the details as best she could recall them. Such a scheme, if it succeeded, would leave her with no honorable choice but to accept the very marriage she had already refused once, since no family of standing would ever again receive a woman whose reputation had been so thoroughly compromised. She understood immediately why her father had grown so quiet since his visit. He had not abandoned his plans for her at all. He had simply moved them into shadows she could not easily see. She brought the news to Alaric that same evening, finding him already troubled by rumors of his own. He had heard, through a business associate with connections in the county, that Lord Vane had recently taken out a substantial loan under suspicious terms, the kind of arrangement a man made only when he intended to erase a debt through means other than honest repayment. The pieces, when laid together, formed a picture neither of them liked. Lord Vane needed the marriage to settle his own mounting debts as much as Eleanor's father needed it to settle his, and neither man appeared willing to let her refusal stand in the way any longer. Alaric's expression, as he considered the situation, grew harder than Eleanor had yet seen it, though his voice remained calm when he spoke. He told her plainly that he would not allow such a scheme to succeed, that he had spent enough years in the world of trade and negotiation to recognize a trap when he saw one forming, and that men who relied on desperation and deception rarely accounted properly for the risks of being caught. He asked her, carefully, whether she had any notion of when this supposed gathering was meant to take place, and Eleanor admitted she did not know precisely, only that Alice's information suggested it would happen soon, likely within the week, before her father's patience or Lord Vane's creditors could wear any thinner. Alaric considered this in silence for a long moment before telling her that he intended to look further into Lord Vane's finances himself, using contacts from his years abroad who owed him favors and asked few questions in return. Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at the determination in his voice, aware that whatever he uncovered could draw him further into a conflict that had never been his to begin with. She told him as much, urging him to consider the risk to his own reputation should his involvement in exposing Lord Vane become widely known. Alaric's response was immediate and firm. He said that he had built his fortune, in part, by learning precisely how men like Lord Vane operated, men who mistook desperation for cleverness and cruelty for strength, and that he had no intention of standing aside while such a man attempted to ruin the life of someone he cared for so deeply. The word he used, care, hung between them for a moment longer than either of them acknowledged aloud, though Eleanor felt its weight settle warmly in her chest, despite the danger gathering around them. She thanked him quietly, unable to find words adequate to the gratitude and fear tangled together inside her, and he responded only by promising that he would not let anything happen to her, a promise she desperately wanted to believe even as she understood how little control either of them truly had over her father's next move. Over the following days, Eleanor moved through her duties at Mrs. Pemberton's estate with a careful, watchful tension, aware that any invitation arriving at the door might be the very trap Alice had warned her of. Mrs. Pemberton, sensing the shift in her companion's mood, asked no direct questions, though she made a point of keeping Eleanor close, finding small tasks that required her presence rather than sending her out alone on errands as she once had. The invitation, when it finally arrived, came disguised exactly as Alice had predicted, addressed not from Lord Vane directly but from a family friend of his, a Mrs. Caldwell, whom Eleanor had never met, inviting her to a small evening gathering to discuss possible employment as a governess for a wealthy family, recently arrived in the county. It was a clever disguise, precisely calculated to appeal to a young woman in Eleanor's position, offering the promise of a more respectable position than that of a companion, delivered with just enough plausibility to avoid immediate suspicion. Eleanor brought the letter to Alaric that same evening, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it over. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before confirming what they had both already suspected, that Mrs. Caldwell's name did not appear anywhere in his own inquiries into the county's respectable families, and that the address listed for the supposed gathering belonged, in fact, to a property Lord Vane had quietly acquired only months earlier under a different name entirely. The trap was clear now, laid out plainly before them, and Eleanor felt a fresh wave of anger replace her earlier fear, as she understood fully the depth of her father and Lord Vane's willingness to destroy her future rather than accept her refusal. Alaric, watching the anger settle over her features, told her gently that this fury, properly directed, could serve her far better than fear ever would. and he proposed a plan of his own, one that would turn the very trap meant to ruin her into the instrument of Lord Vane's downfall instead. He explained that he had, over the past several days, gathered enough evidence of Lord Vane's mounting debts and increasingly desperate financial dealings to expose him thoroughly should the need arise. What remained was a matter of timing and witnesses, ensuring that when Lord Vane's scheme was set into motion, it would be exposed publicly and undeniably, before it could inflict any lasting damage on Eleanor's reputation. He asked her, carefully, whether she trusted him enough to walk directly into the trap that had been laid for her, knowing that he would be close behind, ready to intervene the moment it was needed. The request was not a small one, and Eleanor felt the full weight of it as she considered her answer. She had trusted her own instincts once already, on the night she refused Lord Vane in front of a room full of guests, and that trust had cost her dearly. Yet the trust she felt toward Alaric now felt different entirely, built not on desperation but on weeks of quiet honesty, of a friendship that had asked nothing of her except her own truth. She told him, after a long moment of consideration, that she did trust him, and that she would rather face this danger directly, with his support close behind, than continue living in fear of whatever scheme her family might next devise. They spent the following days preparing carefully, Alaric arranging for 2 trusted witnesses, respected members of the county whose testimony could not easily be dismissed, to be present near the property at the appointed hour, while Eleanor rehearsed, again and again, exactly how she would respond should Lord Vane attempt to corner her the moment she arrived. Mrs. Pemberton, once informed of the full situation, insisted on accompanying Eleanor as far as the property's entrance, refusing to allow her young companion to walk into such danger entirely without support of her own. The night of the supposed gathering arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire estate, the air thick with an anticipation, neither excitement nor dread but some uneasy combination of both. Eleanor dressed carefully, her hands steady now despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, aware that whatever happened in the coming hours would determine not only her own future, but the fate of the 2 men who had spent months treating her life as though it belonged entirely to them. As the carriage rolled toward the address Lord Vane had so carefully disguised, Eleanor found herself thinking not of her father's cold calculations or Lord Vane's cruel schemes, but of the quiet orchard where she had first learned what it felt like to be seen clearly by someone who wanted nothing from her except her own honest self. Whatever waited for her at the end of this carriage ride, she resolved to face it as that woman, not the frightened girl who had once fled her family's dining room in tears, but someone who had finally learned the true cost and the true value of refusing to be anyone's obligation. Mrs. Pemberton sat beside her in the carriage, her usual sharp composure softened by evident worry, though she said little as the wheels turned over the uneven road. She reached over once, midway through the journey, and pressed Eleanor's hand firmly in her own, a small gesture that carried more comfort than any words could have offered. When the carriage finally slowed before a modest but well-kept house on the edge of the county, its windows glowing with lamplight against the darkening evening, Mrs. Pemberton insisted on walking with her as far as the entrance, refusing to be dissuaded despite Eleanor's quiet protests that she did not wish to draw the widow into danger. At the door, a servant Eleanor did not recognize greeted them with practiced courtesy, explaining that Mrs. Caldwell was delayed but expected shortly, and leading Eleanor alone into a small sitting room, while Mrs. Pemberton was shown, with polite insistence, to wait elsewhere. Eleanor understood immediately that this separation had been planned, another careful piece of the trap designed to leave her isolated at the crucial moment, and she forced herself to remain calm, remembering Alaric's promise that he would not be far behind. She had barely settled into a chair near the unlit fireplace when the door opened again, not to admit the mysterious Mrs. Caldwell, but Lord Vane himself, dressed as though for an ordinary evening call, his expression carrying none of the false warmth he had shown at the Cranmore garden weeks before. He closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. He wasted little time on pretense, informing her plainly that Mrs. Caldwell did not exist, that the entire arrangement had been designed for precisely the purpose she had likely already guessed, to place her in a compromising position from which no honorable retreat would remain possible. He spoke as though explaining a simple business transaction rather than an act of cruelty, describing how her discovery here, alone with him, unchaperoned and unexplained, would leave her family with no choice but to accept the marriage she had so foolishly refused, and would leave her, in turn, with no choice but to accept it as well. Eleanor felt anger rise hot and steady beneath her fear, and she made herself speak clearly, refusing to let her voice waver despite the danger of the moment. She told him that his scheme revealed far more about his own desperation than it did about any power he held over her, that a man secure in his own worth had no need to trap a woman into a marriage she had already refused with full clarity of mind. Lord Vane's expression flickered with irritation at her defiance, and he took a step closer, his earlier composure beginning to crack at the edges. It was at that precise moment that the door opened once more, not to admit a servant this time, but Alaric, flanked by the two witnesses he had arranged in advance, respected gentlemen of the county whose presence alone was enough to drain the color entirely from Lord Vane's face. Alaric's voice, when he spoke, carried none of the calm restraint he had shown at the garden party weeks earlier, replaced instead by a controlled fury that filled the small room with an unmistakable authority. He informed Lord Vane, in front of the two witnesses, that he had spent the past several days gathering full evidence of his mounting debts, his falsified arrangements, and the deliberate deception used to lure Eleanor into this very house under false pretenses. He named, precisely and without hesitation, the creditors Lord Vane had been avoiding, the loan taken under a false name, and the property purchased quietly to disguise its true ownership, laying out each detail with the calm precision of a man who had built his fortune by understanding exactly how desperate men attempted to hide their failures. Lord Vane's protests grew increasingly weak as Alaric continued, the two witnesses exchanging grim, confirming glances as the full scope of the scheme became clear. Eleanor watched, her earlier fear giving way slowly to a fierce, unfamiliar satisfaction, as the man who had spent months trying to reduce her to a mere solution for his debts, found himself, for the first time, entirely without power over the situation he had so carefully arranged. Whatever came next, she understood already that the trap set to destroy her future had instead become the very evidence that would finally set her free of it. The two witnesses who had accompanied Alaric that evening did not stay silent for long. Within days, the details of Lord Vane's scheme, his falsified debts, his disguised property, and the trap he had laid to force Eleanor into an unwanted marriage, had spread through the county with the same speed and thoroughness that the earlier rumors of her refusal once had. This time, however, the story cast her not as a foolish girl unable to appreciate a good arrangement, but as a woman who had narrowly escaped a calculated act of cruelty at the hands of a man now revealed to be drowning in debts, and desperate enough to ruin an innocent reputation to save his own. Lord Vane's standing in the county collapsed almost overnight. Invitations he had once received without question began to disappear entirely. Creditors who had shown patience while his reputation remained intact grew suddenly insistent, no longer willing to extend the courtesy of discretion to a man now openly disgraced. Eleanor heard, through Alice's ever-reliable network of servant gossip, that he had begun making arrangements to leave the county altogether, unable to bear the weight of a scandal entirely of his own making. Her father's reaction to the unfolding scandal proved far more complicated. Edgar Ashworth arrived at Mrs. Pemberton's estate only 2 days after the confrontation, his face pale and drawn, none of the calculating confidence he had shown during his previous visit remaining. He asked to speak with Eleanor privately, and though her instinct was to refuse him entirely, Mrs. Pemberton encouraged her to hear him out, reminding her gently that whatever he had done, the conversation might offer her a measure of closure she had not yet allowed herself to seek. They spoke in the same small sitting room where she had once received the letter that first brought word of Lord Vane's growing impatience. Her father seemed smaller somehow, the confidence that had once filled every room he entered now replaced by something closer to shame. He admitted, haltingly, that he had known more of Lord Vane's plan than he had let on, that his own desperation over the family's debts had made him willing to overlook warning signs he should have recognized immediately, and that the thought of what might have happened to her, had Alaric not intervened, now haunted him more than he could easily express. Eleanor listened to his admission without offering the easy forgiveness he seemed to hope for. She reminded him, with a calm steadiness that surprised even herself, of the months she had spent banished to a small room near the kitchens, of the allowance stripped away, of the humiliation he had allowed to unfold at his own dinner table without ever once asking what she truly wanted for her own life. She told him that his shame now, however genuine, did not erase the harm already done, and that whatever relationship remained possible between them would require far more than a single difficult conversation to rebuild. Her father accepted this with a quiet nod, offering no argument, no attempt to minimize what she had said. He told her, before he left, that he understood if she needed time, and that he would not press her further, though he hoped, eventually, she might find a way to forgive him, not for his own sake alone, but because he did not wish to lose his daughter entirely over mistakes he now recognized with painful clarity. Eleanor did not promise him anything, though she found, watching his carriage disappear down the drive for the second time, that her anger had softened slightly into something more complicated, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. The days that followed brought a different kind of attention entirely, one Eleanor found far more difficult to navigate than the earlier gossip. Families who had once whispered cruelly about her refusal now sought her company with sudden enthusiasm, eager to associate themselves with the woman whose story had captured the county's imagination, and eager, too, to draw closer to the reclusive duke whose intervention had made the story so compelling. Eleanor found the sudden reversal almost more exhausting than the earlier scorn, aware that most of the warmth now directed toward her had little to do with genuine regard, and everything to do with her association with Alaric's wealth and title. Mrs. Pemberton, ever perceptive, noticed her growing fatigue, and took it upon herself to manage the flood of invitations and callers, accepting only those she judged genuine, and turning away the rest with the same sharp efficiency she applied to every other aspect of her household. She told Eleanor, one quiet evening as they sat together by the fire, that she had watched enough of society's fickle attention over her long life to recognize true friendship from opportunistic curiosity, and that Eleanor would do well to trust her own instincts on the matter, rather than feeling obligated to accept every hand extended toward her, now that her fortunes had shifted. Eleanor took the advice to heart, growing more selective in the company she kept, and found herself, in the quiet hours between the demands of her renewed social standing, returning again and again to the orchard where everything had truly begun. Alaric met her there as often as his own obligations allowed, though even he had not been entirely spared the sudden surge of attention, his estate receiving more callers in the weeks following the confrontation than it likely had in the entire time since his return to England. It was during one of these quieter evenings in the orchard that Alaric raised, for the first time, the question of what she wanted her future to look like now that the immediate danger had passed. He asked her carefully, without pressure, whether she intended to return to her father's household, whether she wished to remain indefinitely as Mrs. Pemberton's companion, or whether some other path entirely called to her now that the choice, finally, belonged fully to her own judgment. Eleanor considered the question seriously, aware of how rarely in her life anyone had asked her to consider her own wishes without an agenda attached to the answer. She told him honestly that she did not yet know precisely what shape she wanted her future to take, only that she knew, with absolute certainty now, that she would never again allow herself to be treated as an obligation to be managed or a debt to be settled. Whatever came next, she said, she intended to choose it deliberately, with the same clarity of mind that had led her to refuse Lord Vane in the first place, regardless of how much easier it might have been to simply accept what others expected of her. Alaric listened to her answer with visible respect, though something in his expression suggested he had hoped, perhaps, for a more specific answer, one that included some mention of himself among the possibilities she was considering. Eleanor noticed the flicker of uncertainty crossing his features, so unlike his usual steady composure, and found herself, for the first time, initiating the kind of honesty between them that he had so often extended toward her. She told him, quietly, that whatever future she chose, she hoped it would include him, not out of gratitude for his protection or admiration for his wealth, but because the weeks they had spent together in this quiet orchard had shown her a version of companionship she had never known existed, one built on honesty rather than obligation, on genuine regard rather than convenient arrangement. She admitted that the thought of a future without his steady presence in it now felt far more frightening than any scandal her father or Lord Vane had ever threatened her with. Alaric's expression shifted at her words, the uncertainty giving way to something warmer, more open than she had yet seen from him. He stepped closer, taking both her hands in his this time, and told her that he had spent weeks searching for the right moment to say what he was about to say, uncertain whether it was too soon, whether the scandal surrounding them had complicated matters too thoroughly for his feelings to be trusted as genuine, rather than simply protective. He told her, finally, that he loved her, not out of pity for her circumstances or duty toward correcting an injustice, but because she had shown him, from the very first evening he saw her standing at the edge of Mrs. Pemberton's garden, a strength and honesty he had not expected to find in anyone, least of all someone treated so carelessly by the very people meant to protect her. Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly at his words, though they carried none of the bitterness that had accompanied so many of her tears over the past months. She told him, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, that she loved him too, that somewhere between their first quiet conversation in this very orchard and the moment he had walked into that disguised house to save her from Lord Vane's trap, her own guarded heart had opened to him fully, without her even realizing how completely it had happened. They stood together beneath the orchard trees as the last light of evening faded around them, neither speaking further, the silence between them carrying a certainty that needed no additional words. Whatever challenges still remained, whatever adjustments her family or society still required, Eleanor understood now that she faced them not as the frightened, overlooked daughter who had once fled her father's dining room, but as a woman who had finally claimed the right to choose her own future, and who had found, in the process, someone willing to stand beside her rather than above her, honoring the choice she had made rather than attempting to control it. The news of their understanding, though not yet formally announced, did not remain private for long. Mrs. Pemberton guessed the truth almost immediately from the change in Eleanor's manner the following morning, the lightness in her step, the way her gaze drifted often toward the window facing the neighboring estate. The widow said nothing directly, though she permitted herself a small, satisfied smile over breakfast that told Eleanor plainly enough that her secret had already been discovered. Word reached her father within the week, carried by one of the many acquaintances now eager to associate themselves with any news touching the Ashworth family's unexpected rise in fortune. Edgar Ashworth arrived again at Mrs. Pemberton's estate, though this time his manner carried none of the desperation of his earlier visits. He asked, with unusual humility, whether the rumors were true, and when Eleanor confirmed them, he sat quietly for a long moment, before admitting that he did not deserve the good fortune that seemed poised to befall their family now, not after everything he had done to try and force a very different outcome only months before. Eleanor found his humility harder to resist than his earlier anger had ever been, and though she remained cautious, unwilling to forget so quickly the harm his choices had caused her, she allowed herself, for the first time since the night of her refusal, to imagine a future in which some fragile reconciliation with her family might be possible. She told him plainly that any relationship between them going forward would need to be built on honesty rather than convenience, that she would not tolerate being treated again as a means to an end, however fortunate that end might now appear. Her father agreed without hesitation, and though Eleanor remained watchful of whether his changed manner would prove lasting, she permitted herself a small measure of cautious hope. Her mother's reaction, when she finally visited a few days later, proved far simpler and far more moving. Margaret Ashworth arrived alone, without her husband's knowledge, and wept openly the moment she saw her daughter, apologizing repeatedly for her own silence during the months of Eleanor's punishment, for the courage she had lacked to stand against her husband's decisions, even when she had known them to be wrong. Eleanor held her mother as she cried, feeling old wounds begin, slowly and imperfectly, to close, aware that forgiveness, when it came, rarely arrived all at once but gathered gradually, built from small, honest moments like this one. Her younger brother, too, found his way to the estate not long after, arriving on horseback without permission, eager to hear the full story from his sister's own lips, rather than the exaggerated versions already circulating through the county. Eleanor told him everything, watching his youthful face shift between outrage at Lord Vane's cruelty and open admiration for Alaric's intervention, and she found herself laughing, genuinely and freely, for what felt like the first time in months, comforted by the simple, uncomplicated loyalty he had shown her since the very beginning. As the weeks passed, Eleanor and Alaric's relationship deepened steadily, tested occasionally by the demands of a society eager to claim a stake in their story, but never shaken from the foundation of honesty they had built so carefully in the quiet privacy of the orchard. Alaric began introducing her, gradually, to the small circle of genuine friends he had cultivated since his return to England, men and women who valued him for more than his title and fortune, and Eleanor found herself welcomed among them, with a warmth entirely unlike the opportunistic curiosity she had grown so weary of elsewhere. Lord Vane, meanwhile, disappeared from the county entirely, his creditors finally catching up to him in full, forcing the sale of much of his remaining property to settle debts that could no longer be disguised or delayed. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the danger he had once posed to her future had been fully and permanently removed, allowing her to focus instead on the life now opening before her, rather than the fear that had once defined so much of her existence. It was on a warm evening in early summer, nearly 2 months after the confrontation that had exposed Lord Vane's scheme, that Alaric asked her to walk with him one final time to the orchard, though this visit, she sensed immediately, carried a different weight than their many quiet evenings before it. He seemed unusually nervous as they walked, a rare crack in the calm composure she had come to associate so completely with him, and when they reached the same spot beneath the blossoming trees where he had first told her he loved her, he stopped, turning to face her fully, his expression a careful mixture of hope and vulnerability she had never before seen him wear so openly. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, some instinct already anticipating what was about to happen, though nothing could have fully prepared her for the moment when Alaric lowered himself to one knee before her, drawing a small velvet box from his coat with hands that trembled slightly despite his usual steadiness. He told her, his voice thick with emotion he no longer attempted to hide, that he had spent his entire life avoiding the kind of arranged, obligatory unions his family had once expected of him, certain he would never find anyone worth surrendering his hard-won independence for, until the evening he had first seen her standing quietly at the edge of Mrs. Pemberton's garden, and every certainty he had built for himself had begun, slowly and completely, to change. He asked her then whether she would marry him, not as an arrangement to settle debts or satisfy family expectations, but as a choice made freely by two people who had found, against every unlikely circumstance, something rare and honest between them. Eleanor, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, did not hesitate before answering, understanding fully, for the first time in her life, what it meant to say yes to something entirely and joyfully her own choice, rather than a burden placed upon her by anyone else's ambition. News of the engagement spread through the county with a speed that outmatched even the earlier scandal surrounding Lord Vane's downfall, though this time the whispers carried nothing but admiration and delight. Mrs. Pemberton wept openly when Eleanor told her, insisting through her tears that she had suspected as much from the very beginning and had simply been waiting, with as much patience as she could manage, for the two of them to catch up to what had already been obvious to everyone else. Eleanor's parents received the news with reactions that reflected everything Eleanor had already come to expect from each of them. Her mother arrived within a day, embracing her daughter with a warmth unclouded by any calculation, genuinely thrilled at the prospect of her daughter's happiness, rather than the advantage the marriage might bring the family. Her father's joy, though real enough, carried an undertone Eleanor recognized immediately, a quiet relief that whatever damage his earlier scheming had caused, fortune had somehow delivered an outcome even better than the one he had originally hoped to arrange through far less honorable means. Eleanor addressed this directly during their conversation, telling her father plainly that she expected him to understand the difference between what had happened and what he had once attempted to force. She had not agreed to marry Alaric to solve her family's financial troubles, and she would not permit him to treat her engagement as vindication for schemes he should never have attempted in the first place. Her father, to his credit, accepted the correction without argument, offering instead a genuine, if imperfect, apology for the months of punishment he had inflicted upon her, and a promise to do better by her in whatever years remained for their relationship to heal. The wedding preparations that followed brought their own particular challenges, as Alaric's position meant that even a relatively modest ceremony drew far more attention than either of them would have preferred. Mrs. Pemberton, delighted to have some purpose beyond her usual quiet routine, threw herself into the planning with considerable energy, insisting that Eleanor deserved a celebration worthy of everything she had endured to reach this moment, though she respected Eleanor's wishes for something intimate rather than grand. Alaric, for his part, proved surprisingly attentive to the details, more involved in the planning than Eleanor had expected from a man who had spent so many years avoiding society's expectations entirely. He told her, when she remarked on this, that he had spent enough of his life letting other people decide the shape of important moments, and that he intended this particular occasion to reflect exactly what the two of them wanted, nothing borrowed from convention simply because convention demanded it. They chose a small chapel near Alaric's estate for the ceremony itself, its stone walls softened by ivy much like the gardens where their friendship had first taken root, and decided on a guest list that favored genuine affection over social obligation, much to the disappointment of several families who had hoped to secure an invitation through their newfound enthusiasm for the couple's story. Mrs. Pemberton sat at the very front, beaming with open pride, while Eleanor's mother and younger brother occupied the seats beside her, her father positioned a respectful distance away, present but no longer at the center of decisions that were, at last, entirely Eleanor's own to make. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the kind of gentle spring weather that seemed almost deliberately chosen to match the lightness Eleanor felt in her chest as Alice, now permanently in her service by Eleanor's own insistence, helped her dress in a simple gown of pale ivory, far removed from the borrowed blue she had worn to the Cranmore garden party so many months before. Eleanor studied her reflection for a long moment before the ceremony began, hardly recognizing the calm, steady woman looking back at her, so different from the frightened girl who had once fled her father's dining room in tears. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of warmth and quiet joy, Alaric's voice steady and sure as he spoke his vows, Eleanor's own voice matching his certainty despite the emotion tightening her throat. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, The small chapel erupted into genuine, unrestrained celebration, a marked contrast to the cold, calculating dinner table where this entire story had first begun. The wedding breakfast that followed at Alaric's estate carried the same intimate warmth as the ceremony itself, guests mingling freely among the gardens Eleanor had once watched from a distance, never imagining she would one day walk them as their rightful mistress. Mrs. Pemberton claimed a place of honor beside the newlyweds, declaring loudly and without any embarrassment that she intended to visit as often as propriety allowed, unwilling to surrender her role in Eleanor's life now that the girl had finally found the happiness she deserved. As the celebration continued into the afternoon, Eleanor found a quiet moment to slip away toward the orchard, drawn back to the place where everything between herself and Alaric had truly begun. She had not gone far before she heard his footsteps behind her, unsurprised to find he had noticed her absence, and followed without hesitation. He joined her beneath the same blossoming trees where he had first confessed his feelings, where he had later knelt to ask for her hand, and the two of them stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the distant sounds of their wedding celebration, carrying faintly on the warm afternoon air. Alaric told her, quietly, that he could hardly believe how much his life had changed since the evening he had first noticed her standing at the edge of Mrs. Pemberton's garden, a stranger whose quiet dignity had caught his attention before he even knew her name. He said that he had spent so many years building a fortune and a life entirely his own, certain that independence and happiness could never coexist with the kind of partnership his family had once tried to force upon him, only to discover, through her, that true partnership required no sacrifice of independence at all, only the willingness to be honestly known by someone who valued that honesty above every other consideration. Eleanor, resting her head against his shoulder as the afternoon light filtered gently through the orchard leaves, told him that she had learned something similar through everything they had endured together, that the very refusal which had once cost her so dearly, the single word that had turned her own family against her, had ultimately led her to exactly the life she would have chosen for herself all along, had anyone ever thought to ask what she truly wanted. They returned to the celebration soon after, hand in hand, greeted warmly by guests who had come to know, through the story that had spread across the county, exactly what this marriage represented, not merely the joining of two fortunes or two respected names, but the triumph of a woman who had refused to be treated as an obligation, and the man who had chosen to stand beside her rather than above her when it mattered most. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Alaric's household became known throughout the county not for its wealth or its title, though both remained considerable, but for the warmth and fairness with which they treated everyone who crossed their threshold, servants and guests alike. Mrs. Pemberton remained a frequent and beloved presence in their lives until the end of her days, often remarking to anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first evening she saw Eleanor's distracted gaze drifting toward the neighboring estate, exactly how the story would eventually unfold. Eleanor's relationship with her father healed slowly, imperfectly, built on the careful honesty she had insisted upon from the very beginning, while her bond with her mother and younger brother grew steadily closer, unburdened by the calculations that had once shadowed so much of her family's affection. Lord Vane's name faded gradually from local memory, mentioned only rarely as a cautionary tale of desperation and deceit, while the story of the overlooked daughter and the reclusive duke who had defended her honor became, instead, the tale most often repeated among the families of the county, a reminder that courage, however costly in the moment, rarely went entirely unrewarded in the end. Eleanor never forgot the night she had said no, the shattered glass, the silence that had followed, the fear that had gripped her as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, uncertain of what price her defiance would demand. But she came to understand, in time, that this single act of refusal, however painful its immediate consequences, had been the first true choice she had ever made entirely for herself, and that every difficult step which followed, the humiliation, the danger, the slow rebuilding of trust with her family, had led her ultimately to a life built not on obligation or convenience, but on the rare and precious foundation of love freely chosen and freely returned. A year into their marriage, Eleanor found herself standing once again at the edge of the orchard, though now the trees belonged to her as much as to Alaric, part of an estate she had come to think of fully as her own home, rather than a place she merely visited. She had taken to spending her mornings there, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the light move through the branches, and it was during one of these quiet mornings that she began to consider how she might use her own position, so unexpectedly secured, to help other women who found themselves trapped in circumstances similar to the ones she had once endured. She spoke of the idea first to Alaric, tentatively at first, uncertain whether he would think it strange for a duchess to concern herself with the troubles of women far removed from her own current comfort. His response put any such worry to rest immediately. He told her that few causes could matter more to him than one that addressed the very kind of injustice that had so nearly cost them both the life they now shared, and he offered, without hesitation, whatever resources and influence she required to see the idea through. Together, they established a modest fund, quiet and largely unannounced, meant to assist women whose families had attempted to force unwanted marriages upon them, offering both financial support and, where needed, a safe place to stay while they determined their own path forward. Mrs. Pemberton, delighted to be included in the effort, offered her own estate as one such refuge, declaring that she had spent quite enough of her later years managing only her own household affairs, and welcomed the chance to be useful to others in the same way she had once been useful to Eleanor. Word of the fund spread quietly through certain circles, reaching families and daughters who had nowhere else to turn, and though Eleanor never sought public credit for the effort, preferring the work itself to any recognition it might bring, she found deep satisfaction in knowing that her own painful experience had become, in some small way, a source of protection for others facing similar circumstances. She met, over the following years, several young women whose situations echoed her own so closely that she often found herself moved to tears by the parallels, grateful each time that she had something concrete to offer beyond mere sympathy. Her relationship with her father continued its slow, careful healing throughout these years. Edgar Ashworth, humbled thoroughly by the events that had nearly cost him his daughter entirely, became in time a quieter and more thoughtful man than he had ever been during Eleanor's childhood, taking a genuine interest in her work with the fund and even contributing, on occasion, connections and resources of his own to help identify families in need of assistance. Eleanor did not forget the pain he had once caused her, but she found, as the years passed, that she no longer carried it as a constant weight, choosing instead to hold both the memory of his failures and the evidence of his genuine change, without letting either erase the other. Her younger brother grew into a thoughtful young man who often visited the estate during his holidays from school, always eager to hear updates on the women the fund had helped, and increasingly vocal in his own belief that women deserved far greater say in decisions that shaped their lives, a conviction Eleanor took quiet pride in knowing she had helped instill in him through her own example. Her mother, too, grew steadily more confident in her own voice as the years passed, no longer the soft-spoken woman who had once delivered painful news without meeting her daughter's eyes, but someone who spoke her mind plainly, particularly on matters concerning her daughter's happiness and well-being. Alaric's own reputation in the county continued to grow, not merely as a wealthy and reclusive nobleman, but as a man known for his fairness in business and his willingness to challenge the kind of cruel, self-serving schemes that had once nearly destroyed his wife's future. Merchants and tenants alike spoke of him with genuine respect rather than mere deference to his title, and Eleanor often reflected that the very independence he had built for himself during his years abroad, the refusal to be shaped entirely by other people's expectations, had made him exactly the kind of partner capable of standing beside her rather than trying to control the path she chose to walk. Their household in time grew to include children of their own, and Eleanor found herself in raising them, particularly attentive to the lessons she wished to pass on, determined that her own daughters, should she be blessed with them, would grow up understanding that their voices and choices mattered as much as any sons, and that no family debt or convenient arrangement should ever be permitted to outweigh their own right to decide the shape of their futures. Alaric shared this conviction fully, and their children grew up in a household defined not by the cold calculations that had once shaped Eleanor's own childhood, but by warmth, honesty, and a steady respect for each person's right to be heard. Looking back, in the quiet years that followed, Eleanor often thought of the frightened, humiliated girl who had once climbed the stairs to a small room near the kitchens, certain that her single act of defiance had cost her everything that mattered. She had not known, in that dark moment, how completely that single refusal would eventually reshape her entire life, leading her not to ruin, as she had once feared, but to a partnership built on genuine respect, a family healed slowly through honest effort, and a purpose that extended far beyond her own happiness, to touch the lives of countless women who might otherwise have faced their own difficult circumstances entirely alone. She understood, at last, that the courage it had taken to say no, standing alone against her father's anger and Lord Vane's cold ambition, had been worth every difficult consequence that followed, not because the path afterward had been easy, but because it had been, from that very first moment of defiance onward, entirely and unmistakably her own. 3 years after her wedding, Eleanor received a letter that reminded her, more sharply than anything had in a long while, of exactly why the fund she and Alaric had built together mattered so deeply. The letter came not from a stranger but from a young woman named Charlotte Fenwick, the daughter of a modest landowner 2 counties away, whose situation Eleanor recognized immediately from the very first paragraph, having lived through nearly the same circumstances herself years before. Charlotte wrote that her father intended to marry her off within the month to a man 3 times her age, a widower with considerable land but a reputation for cruelty that had already driven away 2 previous wives, under circumstances the local gossip refused to fully explain. Charlotte had heard, through a distant cousin, whispers of a quiet fund that helped women in her position, and she wrote with the careful, desperate hope of someone who had exhausted every other option available to her. Eleanor brought the letter to Alaric that same evening, her hands steady now in a way they would not have been years before, though the old anger still stirred readily enough at the thought of another young woman facing the same trap she herself had barely escaped. Alaric read the letter twice, his expression grave, and agreed immediately that they should act, though he cautioned that Charlotte's situation, unfolding 2 counties away and involving a family they knew nothing about, would require more careful handling than anything they had attempted before. They decided, after careful discussion, that Eleanor herself should travel to meet Charlotte directly, accompanied by Alaric and a small trusted party, rather than relying solely on letters and intermediaries as they had with earlier cases. Mrs. Pemberton, though slowed somewhat by age, insisted on joining them as well, declaring that she had not spent years assisting with this work, merely to be left behind, now that a case had finally proven interesting enough to leave the county for. The journey took the better part of 2 days, along roads far rougher than those Eleanor had grown accustomed to near her own estate, and she found herself, during the long hours in the carriage, thinking often of her own journey away from her father's house years before, the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied every mile. She hoped, fiercely, that whatever awaited Charlotte at the end of this particular story would prove kinder than what she herself had once faced, though she understood already, from painful experience, that such outcomes were never guaranteed. They arrived at a modest inn in the small town nearest the Fenwick estate, and it was there, in a private parlor arranged through careful and discreet correspondence, that Eleanor finally met Charlotte in person. The girl was younger than Eleanor had expected, barely 17, with a nervous, watchful manner that reminded Eleanor painfully of her own state of mind during the darkest weeks following her refusal of Lord Vane. Charlotte's hands trembled as she recounted her situation more fully, describing a father grown increasingly desperate over gambling debts, a suitor whose reputation for cruelty toward his previous wives had never been properly investigated by anyone with the power or inclination to do so, and a mother too frightened of her own husband's temper to offer any meaningful resistance. Eleanor listened with the particular attentiveness she had developed over years of hearing similar stories, careful not to rush Charlotte toward conclusions, but allowing her the space to voice fears she had likely never been permitted to speak aloud within her own household. When Charlotte finally asked, hesitantly, whether there was truly any way to escape the marriage without destroying her family entirely, Eleanor found herself answering with the same honesty she wished someone had offered her years before. She told Charlotte plainly that escaping such a marriage would likely cost her something, whether her family's immediate approval, her standing among certain circles of local society, or simply the comfort of the only life she had ever known, but that the cost of remaining trapped in a marriage to a man capable of cruelty would almost certainly prove far greater and far more permanent. She shared, briefly and without excessive detail, her own story, the dinner table refusal, the months of punishment, the danger she had faced before finding her way to a life entirely her own choosing, offering it not as guaranteed proof that Charlotte's own story would end as happily, but as evidence that survival, and even genuine happiness remained possible on the other side of such a difficult choice. Alaric, for his part, focused his efforts on the practical matter of Charlotte's suitor's reputation, using his own network of contacts to gather testimony from those who had witnessed the treatment of the man's previous wives. What he uncovered within a matter of days proved damning enough that even Charlotte's desperate father, once confronted with the full evidence, hesitated to proceed with an arrangement that might expose his own family to scandal should the truth become widely known. The resolution, when it finally came, proved less dramatic than the confrontation with Lord Vane had been years before, though no less meaningful to those involved. Charlotte's father, faced with evidence he could not easily dismiss, and the quiet but unmistakable influence of a duke willing to make his displeasure known throughout the relevant circles, withdrew his support for the marriage entirely, offering Charlotte instead the choice to remain unmarried for the time being, or consider other, less coercive arrangements should she wish to marry eventually. Charlotte, overwhelmed with relief, asked Eleanor before they parted ways what she intended to do now with her unexpected freedom, and Eleanor found herself smiling at the question, remembering how thoroughly it had once frightened her when Alaric had asked something similar in the quiet privacy of the orchard years before. She told Charlotte that there was no need to decide everything at once, that freedom itself was worth appreciating fully before rushing toward whatever came next, and she offered, on behalf of the fund, whatever ongoing support Charlotte might need while she determined her own path forward, whether that meant further education, a period of independence, or simply time to heal from the fear she had carried for so long. The journey home felt different from the journey out, lighter somehow, despite the physical exhaustion of travel. Eleanor found herself reflecting, as the carriage rolled back toward familiar roads, on how completely her own painful history had become something useful, rather than merely something survived. She thought of her younger self, certain in that first terrible week that her single act of refusal had ruined her entirely, and she marveled at how thoroughly that assumption had proven wrong, how the very defiance that had once seemed to end her life as she knew it, had instead opened a path toward a life far richer and more meaningful than anything her father's original plans could have offered her. Alaric, watching her thoughtful expression from across the carriage, reached over to take her hand, asking softly what occupied her thoughts. Eleanor told him simply that she was grateful, not merely for the life they had built together, but for the chance to ensure that other women facing the same darkness she once had might find their way toward the light a little more quickly, with a little more support, than she herself had been fortunate enough to receive. Alaric squeezed her hand gently, telling her that this, more than any title or fortune he had ever possessed, was the legacy he was proudest to help build alongside her. They returned home to find their own children waiting eagerly at the door, full of questions about the journey, and delighted by the small gifts Eleanor had brought back for them from the towns they had passed through. That evening, after the children had been settled for the night, Eleanor walked once more to the orchard, alone this time, standing quietly beneath the same trees that had witnessed so much of her own transformation over the years. She thought of Charlotte, of the countless other women the fund had helped since its quiet beginning, and of the girl she herself had once been, frightened and uncertain, climbing the stairs to a small room near the kitchens with no notion of the life that still awaited her. She understood now, with a clarity that had taken years of difficult experience to earn, that courage rarely announced itself as courage in the moment it was needed most. It had felt, on the night she refused Lord Vane, like nothing more than desperation and fear. Only years later, standing in an orchard that belonged fully to her, surrounded by a family and a purpose she had chosen entirely for herself, did she recognize that single word of refusal for what it had truly been from the very beginning, the first quiet, trembling step toward the life she had always deserved. A letter arrived from Charlotte some months later, and Eleanor opened it with the same careful hope she now brought to every update from the women the fund had helped. Charlotte wrote that she had chosen to pursue further education in the city, staying with a respectable aunt who had welcomed her warmly, and that she had begun, in her own small way, to imagine a future entirely of her own design, one that no longer depended on any man's fortune or temperament to determine her happiness. She thanked Eleanor again for the courage to speak plainly during their meeting at the inn, admitting that she had carried those words with her through every difficult conversation with her father since, and that she hoped, one day, to offer the same kind of honest support to some other frightened young woman standing where she herself had once stood. Eleanor read the letter twice before setting it carefully among the small collection of similar letters she had kept over the years, each one a quiet testament to the fund's growing reach. She showed it to Alaric that evening, and he read it with the same quiet pride he always showed when their work bore fruit, remarking that Charlotte's words about passing the kindness forward captured, better than anything else could, exactly what they had hoped to build when they first established the fund together in the early months of their marriage. As autumn settled over the estate that year, Eleanor found herself increasingly occupied with the fund's expanding work, corresponding with families and daughters across several counties now, training a small group of trusted advocates who could travel to situations she and Alaric could not personally attend, and slowly building something that had begun as a quiet, private effort into a network capable of reaching far beyond what either of them had originally imagined possible. She often thought, during these busy, purposeful days, of Mrs. Pemberton's early words to her, that it did a person good to be seen by someone who wanted nothing from them in return, and she made it her constant aim to offer that same simple gift to every woman who found her way to their door. Her own children grew alongside this work, absorbing its lessons not through lectures but through the quiet example of a household where fairness and honest choice were treated as ordinary expectations rather than rare exceptions. Eleanor watched her eldest daughter, still young but already showing signs of the same quiet determination that had once carried her own mother through the darkest months of her life. And she felt a fierce, grateful hope that whatever challenges the girl might one day face, she would grow up knowing, without ever having to learn it the hard way, that her voice and her choices had always mattered, from the very beginning, exactly as much as anyone else's.